Hi, everyone. My name is Gary Knox. I'm a nursery crops extension specialist and professor of environmental horticulture with the University of Florida. I'm actually located away from main campus at the North Florida Research and Education Center, which is just outside of Tallahassee and just barely outside of Georgia. We're just a few miles from the Georgia border. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you a little bit, give you an overview about invasive ornamentals and non-invasive cultivars that are being developed to help address the invasive plant issues out there. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started here. First of all, I think it's important that we talk about some definitions. There are a lot of different ideas or definitions around about what an invasive plant is. And I think that people sometimes use this term a little too freely, and sometimes really what they're talking about are weeds or weediness as opposed to invasive plant. And by the definitions that I'll be talking on here today, a weed is a plant that is out of place. It's any plant, whether it's native or non-native, that is a nuisance in a man-made landscape, such as gardens, residential areas, or crop fields. And we distinguish a weed from an invasive plant or an alien plant as a plant that is non-native to a natural ecosystem that you're considering, whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And one of the big distinctions here is where we're looking at this plant. If this plant is in Aunt Daisy's garden, it is a weed. But if this plant is showing up in the middle of a state or national forest, then that plant can be considered an invasive plant. So that's the really basic distinction here between a weed and an invasive plant. And the classic example in the South is, of course, kudzu. Kudzu has considered to be the vine that swallowed the South, or at least at one point it was considered that, because it is prominent and evident in landscapes as well as in natural areas. Now, what we're looking at here, the kudzu would be considered a weed because it's a human disturbed landscape, what was formerly a household here. But this same weed, kudzu, also appears in natural areas where it acts as an invasive plant because it displaces other vegetation and otherwise affects the ecosystem. So kudzu is the classic example here. Impact-wise, nationwide, there are estimated to be 5,000 or more invasive plants that have an annual impact of about $120 billion because they reduce crop yields, they damage natural resources, or they require a management in terms of chemical or mechanical control to suppress or remove the plants. And even beyond this actual physical effects of the plants and reducing crop yields and so forth, there are greater effects of invasive plants on natural ecosystems because they can actually change the soil characteristics, soil microorganisms, nutrient levels in the soil, the insect and mammal communities that are in a given ecosystem, and affect the predators, the parasites, and other wildlife through what they call multi-trophic interactions in a given area. They really go much beyond actually reducing crop yields or displacing a plant that otherwise would be native there. Some of the conclusions from previous research with invasive species is that the majority of plant species that are categorized today as invasive were deliberately introduced. And by the time that we recognize the severity of an invasion, it's often too late for effective control, whether it's economic or ecological or mechanical or chemical control measures. The other consideration here is that with global change ongoing, it's likely going to result in a world where we have more rather than fewer invasive species, simply because of the disruptions to ecosystems that global change itself is causing. So going back to that classic invasive plant, kudzu, kudzu was deliberately introduced, and it was not necessarily intentionally introduced to become an invasive plant. It had good intents and purposes when it was introduced. And this is actually a sign that used to be in Washington County, Florida, where it commemorated the fact that kudzu was developed in this particular county and was given to the world as a soil saving, high protein forage plant. And that was widely grown in the US as a drought resisting, erosion controlling plant that compares with alfalfa in pasture and haymaking values. So it certainly had some characteristics that maybe merited its introduction, and I don't think anyone could have anticipated that it would escape and spread the way it did. But this just brings us to the point that there are many times unintended consequences from introducing new species. And let's face it, today, none of us wants to be responsible for introducing the next kudzu or kudzu impact like plant. And I think it's safe to say that growers and landscapers in the green industry support research to scientifically identify invasive plants and to identify or develop alternatives to invasive plants. And none of us are bad guys, or none of us intend to be bad guys by using or introducing plants, but we have to do so responsibly. Now, one of the questions we often find is, well, gosh, what's the big deal? Can't we tell which plants are invasive and which plants aren't? And that way, if we know which plants are invasive, hey, we won't deal with those. It's not quite as a simple answer. And when you look at the characteristics of what makes a plant invasive, we see things like fast growth, flowering and fruiting at a young age, producing large numbers of flowers, fruits, and seeds, plant that is easily and quickly propagated, particularly if seed can be spread by wind or animals, or if vegetative parts can easily break off and root. Invasive plants are often relatively pest-free, and they often outcompete other plants through allelopathy, where roots emit chemicals which suppress growth of other nearby plants. The invasive plant may cast a dense shade that prevents other plants from growing within it or beneath it. And the invasive plant may leaf out earlier, stay green longer, bloom earlier, or bloom longer to otherwise increase the amount of fruits and seeds that it might produce. So these are characteristics or generic characteristics of invasive plants. Now, if we want to look at characteristics of desirable ornamental plants, we end up with almost the same characteristics. In a good ornamental plant, we're looking for a plant with fast growth, flowers and fruits at a young age, produces large numbers of flowers. It is easily and quickly propagated, relatively pest-free, and may leaf out earlier, stay green longer, bloom earlier, or bloom longer. So all these characteristics of a good ornamental plant, unfortunately, overlap with the good characteristics of an invasive plant. Accordingly, some research that was done a number of years ago by Sarah Reichard at Washington State, she did a study that looked at the original origin of about 235 woody plants that are currently naturalized in North America. And her data showed that about 82% of these woody plants were introduced for landscape purposes. And that is the olive green color in the pie chart there of landscape plants. So you can see where the green industry does bear some responsibility in terms of maybe introducing some of these plants, and some responsibility in helping to prevent future introductions or ongoing introductions. So there are a number of reasons that invasive plants that originate as ornamentals eventually escape and become an invasive plant. One reason is typically a widespread use, or a plant that is very broadly adapted to different environmental conditions. Maybe some examples of plants like invasive plants would include things like wisteria, lantana, and Ardesia crenata or coralberry. These are plants that were widespread ornamentals in years gone by and also happen to be broadly adapted. Another potential reason is some of these plants that become invasive are mistakenly grown, sold, and used. Some of the invasive plants resemble a desirable plant and sometimes intentionally or unintentionally or grown and sold because they appear to be this desirable ornamental when in fact they're the invasive counterpart. And examples here are Japanese privet, which is generally well behaved as a non-native plant, versus glossy privet, which is quite a terrible invasive plant. And because the two are so similar, some nurseries in the past may have grown and sold glossy privet thinking it was a Japanese privet, but not. And the two really do look quite a lot alike. Similarly, Boston fern is a well-behaved non-native, whereas sword fern is an extremely invasive plant. But again, they have very similar appearances. Finally, some plants were introduced as ornamentals a very long time ago, and it has taken a long time for these plants to gradually escape into natural areas, to gradually build up numbers, to reproduce, and gradually have these introduced plants spread throughout a natural area. So there's what we would call a lag time involved between when a plant is introduced and when it escapes and becomes an invasive plant in natural areas. And lag times tend to be short for annuals and vines, but as you might expect with a woody plant, it's a particularly long lag time. Another little variable here is lag times tend to be shorter in warm climates, plants adapted to warm climates with long growing seasons, as opposed to cold climates and shorter growing seasons. Here I'm showing a table that has a list of invasive non-native plants, and it shows the date of introduction in the column on the right. So we have mimosa being introduced in 1745, coralberry 1900, elephant ear 1910, silverthorn 1830, lantana the 1700s, Chinese privet 1852, Japanese honeysuckle 1906, Nandina 1804, yellow bamboo 1882, kudzu 1876, Chinese wisteria 1916, and popcorn tree in the 1700s. And all of these plants have ultimately become invasive in natural areas. And you can see they must have had quite a long lag time. Looking at some actual research on lag times in plants, in this case, acacia in Australia, it took 57 years before they determined that acacia was going to be invasive there. In Florida, the Australian pine, casuarina, took 65 years before we realized it was invasive. You can see the data for lantana, 40 years, guava, 90 years, Brazilian pepper, 75 years. And then from Germany comes some average data for shrubs and trees of 136 years and 170 years, respectively. So you can see that it is quite a considerable lag time before some plants are determined to become invasive. Another consideration here is that not everyone can agree on which plants are invasive or on under what conditions the plant becomes invasive, or drawing the line as to when a plant suddenly becomes considered invasive. This is an example that occurred in Florida a couple of decades ago when an organization called the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council started promoting a number of plants that they considered to be invasive based on their presence popping up in state parks and national forests. Whereas a lot of growers and gardeners who grew the plants and used the plants in gardens and landscapes didn't see how such a plant that was seemingly well behaved in landscapes, how it could possibly escape and become a problem in natural areas. And so there's a big disconnect in terms of whether a plant was considered invasive or not. And in this case, of course, the University of Florida was called upon to make some definitions and some decisions and develop some scientific based guideline as to when plant could be considered invasive and when it might not be. So again, what's the big deal? Can't we tell which plants are invasive? And as a result of the work that I mentioned briefly with the University of Florida, and now many other organizations throughout the country and throughout the globe have developed a number of scientific methods to assess non-native plants objectively, science-based guidelines as to one, whether a plant would be considered currently invasive, and if so, where or what regions or under what conditions is that plant invasive? Secondly, if for a given non-native plant, is there potential for this non-native plant to become invasive in the future? And thirdly, some selections, cultivars, or hybrids might be non-invasive because they have limited fertility compared to the wild type or the unimproved non-native plant. Many organizations are developing different scientific methods to assess plants under these three broad categories. In terms of the sorts of information that these assessments look for when determining whether a plant is invasive or not, they look for documentation of the plants in natural areas from looking at herbarium specimens, scientific articles, things like that. They ask for current information from experts that are present in perhaps state parks and national forests and botanical gardens in terms of the presence of these plants in natural areas. And the idea is to be above board and transparent so that all this information and the sources would be available in public record that anybody could go to see and verify that these plants were present in these areas. And again, I need to emphasize these are natural areas, state forests, national forests, not in any sort of roadside conditions, not in gardens, not in agricultural areas. So they're looking for documentation of evidence. And then, as I mentioned, they don't look for these plants, or it's irrelevant if these plants are present in urban, suburban, agricultural lands, in former homesteads, abandoned farms, roadways, or any other human altered areas. They really are only concerned about plants that become invasive in natural areas. So most of these assessment tools, if you will, or methods often are structured as a series of if-then questions that result in point systems and rankings, typically low, medium, high, very high, and oftentimes in four major areas that they're considering here. One is ecological impacts, whether or not the presence of the plant alters the ecosystem, displaces natural vegetation at a level of 15% or more of the area, whether it might hybridize with native plants, or whether it tolerates a wide range of environments and so could be found in a wide range of different ecosystems. These tools also look at the potential for expansion of a non-native plant in natural areas. Is there or has there been a rapid increase in the number of distinct populations? Is there a large amount of suitable habitat surrounding the populations that exist, and so on? Another consideration is how easy or how difficult it is to manage an infestation of this plant. If the plant is difficult to control because it's widespread or resistant to herbicide, that is going to greatly increase the cost and the impacts of this particular non-invasive, non-native plant. Another factor might be whether this plant quickly reseeds or rapidly produces propagules from vegetative plant parts that go on to root. So difficulty of management is a consideration. And finally, even economic value is a consideration as well. Is this plant important because it is a forage plant, a biomass plant, a food plant, a fiber plant? Economic value is an important consideration here as well. So these are the four main categories, if you will, that are often assessed to determine if a plant is invasive or not. In the case of the University of Florida tool, it consists of about 100 questions that the University of Florida staff and regional biologists will tackle in terms of answering. And then they develop conclusions for any given plant separately for each zone within the state. And in the case of Florida, it's basically designed, separated into 3 zones that correspond to USDA cold hardiness zones. Basically, the northern zone, which is zone 8, 8A and 8B, central Florida, which tends to be hardiness zone 9A, and then South Florida, which tends to be hardiness zones 9B and 10. And in other tools used in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, again, it usually corresponds to cold hardiness zones. And it's easy to see why it's a logical separation. Clearly, a plant that flourishes in tropical Miami-Dade County in South Florida would likely suffer from the frequent colds and freezes that we experience in zone 8 of North Florida. And similarly, plants that require a chilling requirement or a winter dormancy of North Florida would not experience that in South Florida and likely would not be able to survive or persist in South Florida conditions. And the same similar things can be said when you're regarding other cold hardiness zones in other parts of the country. I might also add that another consideration, particularly in the West, is the rainfall that an area experiences too. Plants that are adapted to high rainfall conditions would likely not be able to establish in a low rainfall situation and vice versa. So cold hardiness zone is a natural way to categorize plant for invasiveness. Many areas also develop a predictive tool to try to predict in advance whether a plant might become invasive in an area in the future. The first and probably classic tool out there was developed by Australia, and it's called the Australian Weed Risk Assessment. And that is a tool that Australia developed to try to determine whether newly introduced plants might eventually become invasive in Australia. And this system has since been adapted to many other regions across the world, including Florida. And in the case of Florida, it consists of about 49 questions where it's examining recent arrivals to the state, which by our definition are plants that have herbaceous plants that have been in Florida for less than 10 years and woody plants that have been in Florida for less than 20 years. And in this case, what the questions are asking about is they're looking at whether these plants in question have caused problems in areas with similar habitats or similar climates to in our case, to Florida climates and habitats. So it's looking for plants that have become bad actors, if you will, in other similar climates. Finally, in Florida, we are somewhat progressive in that we have also developed a tool that can look at cultivars, varieties, subspecies, or hybrids that might behave differently from the regular or wild type species because it's been to be sterile or to be less fruitful than the regular or wild type plant. And this has become very important because there are a lot of very beautiful ornamental plants that are invasive. But if we can develop sterile forms or less fruitful forms, some of these otherwise invasive ornamentals might be approved for use in a given area because they've been tamed, if you will, and aren't quite as wild as they were. And in the case of Florida, the tool that we use is called the Infraspecific Taxon Protocol and has about 12 questions to it that we can go through and assess a plant for the cultivar that might be less invasive than the wild type. The general assessment tool that we look at to see if plants are currently invasive. This data is old, but as of a few years ago, about 850 species in Florida were evaluated, and almost three-fourths of them were okay to recommend. They were certainly not invasive in any part of Florida. About 15% of the ones that were looked at had a label of, yes, you may recommend them with caution, in that one should keep an eye on these plants because there's some speculation that they may become invasive in the future. And only a small number, about less than 7%, were considered invasive and should not be recommended in Florida. And we should also note that about 5% of plants are already prohibited by the state of Florida Department of Agriculture or by the USDA noxious weed list in terms of not being legally able to be grown. So those plants are automatically considered invasive. Now, the purpose of all these assessment tools is to provide consistent recommendations using science-based information to say whether a given plant can be used in a given area or a given region, so that we know what the plant's behavior is going to be in the long term in terms of impacts to natural areas. And again, emphasizing that this is only in natural areas. So in Florida, who decides on whether a plant is invasive in Florida and whether it can legally be grown or not in Florida? In our case, it's our Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. This department maintains a Florida noxious weed list and maintains a Florida invasive species list. And plants that are on these lists are illegal to grow and sell in the state of Florida. In terms of organizations that provide advice and information to the Florida Department of Ag, it is the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, as well as the University of Florida, which has a group that assesses plants, as I indicated, for potential invasiveness. Now, what's the status in Georgia? In Georgia, the Georgia Department of Agriculture has the official legal and official duties in terms of plant regulations. And to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, the state of Georgia does not have a noxious weed list or prohibited plant list. There are many fewer restrictions on growing plants in Georgia as compared to Florida and a few other states. In Georgia, you do have an exotic pest plant council that can provide advice and information to growers and to gardeners in terms of what could be safely grown. And in addition, of course, the University of Georgia Extension has a very good website on invasive species. And that's the URL address for the University of Georgia website on invasive species. And again, just if you are interested to see what plants are considered invasive, here are the website addresses for the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, the Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council, and then for the University of Florida IFAS assessment tool that determines which plants are invasive in regions in Florida. So you can go there if you're interested just to see what plants are on the list. There are some factors that ongoing and affecting invasive plant lists. For one thing, taxonomy can be a challenge. As we all know, some scientific names have been changing rather rapidly over the last 10 or 20 years, and taxonomy may change a scientific name before the plant lists have time to catch up, if you will. In addition, some areas have developed local regulations on invasive plants on a county level or municipal level, and that can really add complications to the green industry and whether you're a grower or landscaper, if rules and regulations are varying from county to county, let alone from region to region or state to state. And it's in these situations, it's going to be very difficult to teach our clientele and stakeholders to distinguish between weeds and invasive plants or invasive plants and sterile cultivars. This is a situation that Florida experienced a number of years ago where counties and some cities adopted regulations restricting plant use. And the industry did complain about this to the state legislature. And eventually, the Florida state legislature passed legislation that preempted any county or state regulations. But it did add some teeth to the Department of Agriculture noxious weed list and invasive species list. There was some give and take here on so that we don't have to deal with this so much on a county or local situation anymore, but guided by state regulations now in Florida. So I keep going back to the issue of invasive plants, the green industry, and gardeners. None of us wants to be responsible for introducing the next kudzu. We all want to support research to identify invasive plants. We want to support research to develop alternatives to invasive plants. And in the case of Florida, our Florida Nursery Growers and Landscape Association members agreed to phase out production of about 45 invasive ornamentals back in 2001. However, it's been a long process for nurseries to stop growing plants. You can understand that if you're making money off of a plant, it's hard to give up growing that particular plant. And gardeners are as guilty as anybody else because invasive ornamentals can still be found widely grown in landscapes, whether it's coralberry, and that's Ardesia crenata, and that's the hedge of plants behind the amaryllis, the row of amaryllis. You can see a hedge of plants back there with the bright red berries that are typical of coralberry and very prominent and ornamental in this particular landscape. Silverthorn, Elaeagnus pungens, is still often promoted as a fast-growing hedge, but it can produce large numbers of fruits and seed out readily into natural areas. Chinese privet, Ligustrum sinense, is a widely grown, widely impacted invasive plant found throughout Georgia and Florida. It is really a bad news kind of plant, still readily found in landscapes. Nandina is still readily found in landscapes. And finally, wisteria is cultivated and yet is really quite a bad actor in many situations in natural areas. Of course, that's not the whole story. There are a lot of non-native ornamentals that are not invasive. And here we have lists of plants and their dates of introduction into the US. On the left are a series of invasive non-natives that I showed you earlier, including mimosa, coralberry, and so on, going all the way down to wisteria. And on the right is a list of non-invasive non-natives. Camellias have been in the US since 1820, gardenias, 1761, big leaf hydrangea, mid-1800s, Chinese holly, mid-1800s, Chinese juniper, 1767, crepe myrtle since the early 1800s, oleander since 1840, and azaleas since the mid-1800s. These are plants that have all been here for a sufficiently long time that if they were going to become invasive, they would have become invasive by now, and yet they are not. So what's going on? What makes these plants different such that they are not invasive? Unfortunately, we really don't know. We can't determine exactly what are the characteristics that these plants are not invasive. We do need to investigate this further. And again, it's not the whole story either, in that we have a lot of cultivars or improved selections of invasive ornamentals, or some of these plants sterile or different enough or less fruitful enough to be non-invasive. And as a matter of fact, we need research in this area, and that's an area in which we have been doing quite a bit of research over the last 20 years or so here at the University of Florida, we developed a team to look at research on invasive ornamentals, consisting of several faculty in the Department of Environmental Horticulture scattered all over the state, present in different parts of the state, with some different research topics, from genetic techniques to look at sterile forms of plants, conventional breeding to develop sterile forms, and then a team that was evaluating cultivars of invasive ornamentals to look for non-invasive types. And that is one area I'm going to spend a little more time on here currently, in terms of the plant Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo, which the old-fashioned type or the wild type has long been used as an ornamental in the South, as you see here. And it's long been known to fruit heavily, and the fruit are considered one of the ornamental characteristics of the old-fashioned heavenly bamboo. But more modern times, we tend to use many more cultivars that are dwarf and compact, that are grown quite widely and are becoming used in the landscape quite widely. And as you can see, they differ very greatly from the wild form of Nandina domestica. So, question we began asking, are some of these existing cultivars sterile or much less invasive than the wild type Nandina or old-fashioned Nandina? And a corollary question here is, do these new cultivars perform as well in different parts of Florida, different regions of Florida? And does the invasiveness of these new cultivars vary from region of Florida? We've done a series of studies with the invasive Nandina domestica, and it is no question that it is invasive in Florida. This plant is native to central China and Japan and west to India. It's thought to have been introduced to the U.S. around 1804, and it's been documented to escape into natural areas in 9 states of the Southeast, including Florida, and has been found in many counties throughout Florida. Studies with the ecosystems in Florida have found that it is invading, altering the light environment of hardwood forests in North Florida, and is displacing native vegetation, including plants like the Florida endangered red columbine and the rare oak leaf hydrangea. We really don't have good documentation of its potential for invasive in Central and South Florida, and that is one of the reasons also that we embarked on some research with Nandina. So the photo on the left in this slide shows you in McClay Gardens State Park, in the natural area of McClay Gardens, shows you a very healthy Nandina domestica that is fruiting there in the woods under the canopy of a live oak in this case. Dr. Sandy Wilson and I embarked on Nandina trials in South and North Florida, starting about 15 to 20 years ago, to investigate the fruit production of these cultivars and to see if some could be considered sterile. Now, in the middle of our research projects, some new research came out in 2011, where they looked at the potential for even partially sterile cultivars of plants, and whether partially sterile cultivars of plants could still become invasive in landscape situation or in the wild. And what they found was that for long-lived perennial shrubs and trees, we need to reduce fertility or seed production 95 to 100% in order to guarantee that population would not continue to become invasive in a natural area. So this raises the standard, or raises the bar for us to look for plants that are at least have 95% fewer fruit than the wild type or normal plant, in order to be able to say that plant will not become invasive in a given region. As I said, we've been working in this area for almost 20 years, and we worked on over 25 different cultivars of Nandina in zones 8B and 9B. And the cultivars shown here are the ones that have 95 to 100% fewer fruit than the old-fashioned plant or the wild-type Nandina. And in each case, the studies were done over many years, but in each case it was about 2 to 3 years, any one location. And they were in-ground plantings. And the ones that we found are truly non-invasive in Florida: blush pink, shine, filamentosa, firehouse, fire power, firestorm, flirt, Gulfstream, Harbor Dwarf, Harbor Bell, Lemon Lime, Moon Bay, Obsession, Sunray, Twilight, and a twisted leaf form. You'll note that some of these are older cultivars and some of these are rather newer cultivars. And at least on Florida conditions, these could all be safely grown as being non-invasive. And we're going through the process of verifying this through the University of Florida assessment tool so that we can get official recognition that these plants are non-invasive. Now, the plants that were in the same study that did not have this kind of fruit reduction, and so are considered invasive in zones 8B and 9B of Florida, are the old-fashioned type or wild type Nandina, and the cultivars Alba, Compacta, Emerald C, Lowboy, Moyer's Red, Plum Passion, Royal Princess, Sienna Sunrise, and Clichy. Now, as I said, we evaluated roughly 25 cultivars, and believe it or not, there were probably 25 to 50 additional cultivars that are out there in the market. But many of these are not widely grown anymore, and in most cases, we weren't able to find sources of these plants to include in our research. And that's really the only reason why these other cultivars weren't included. Or some of the cultivars have only just recently been introduced, and we haven't really had the chance to evaluate some of the brand new cultivars yet. In terms of some general implications of these studies, I think it illustrates there's a tremendous variation in growth, fruiting, and seed viability among cultivars of a given species, as well as among regions within Florida in this case. And I'm sure it varies with regions throughout the rest of the country as well. It really does emphasize the importance of including cultivars in these assessment tools that are looking at invasive potential, since many existing cultivars already are sterile or virtually sterile. It demonstrates the importance of trialing in more than one location, since we found some cultivars that were invasive in North Florida, but not invasive in South Florida, for example. And also it shows you there's an opportunity to promote these non-invasive or sterile cultivars. Again, going to the topic of the future of invasive plants, I think it does show that there is a potential to develop sterile forms of some of these invasive ornamental. And there are a series of different ways that sterile forms might be developed. One is just through traditional breeding techniques. Although with woody plants, as we know, there's a long lag times between plants flowering and potential flowered fruit. And so that is not a very speedy effort to go through traditional breeding. Polyploidy is a way to introduce sterility into plants. It's a little faster. Interspecific hybridization, or hybridizing an invasive species with some non-invasive relatives. Mutagenesis, in other words, using plants that will induce mutations in progeny that might thereby be sterile. And then some of the newer transgenic methods where you target expression of certain genes, or you alter metabolic or hormonal signaling to affect flowering or fruiting or fruit production, or you alter reproductive tissues. And these are all pretty much almost science fiction type methods that have become real world thanks to modern research and technology. So these are the methods that people are currently using to develop sterile ornamentals. And these are just some examples of some crops in which they've used different methods to develop sterile cultivars or nearly sterile cultivars, and then the cause of sterility there on the far right. Euonymus elatus, they've developed cultivars that by altering the ploidy have an uneven division of chromosomes, and so the plant cannot produce viable seeds. Lantana camera has used interploid hybridization. Ruellia simplex, similarly interploid hybridization and polyploidy. And these latter two, I'll go into a little bit more detail because it was actually work that was done at the University of Florida that have led to these results here. So firstly, looking at Mexican petunia, Ruellia simplex, or in the past known as Ruellia bertoniana. It's a species that in Florida has escaped cultivation in at least 27 counties. And it's also been found to escape in 6 neighboring states, including Texas and Georgia. And it's pretty widespread throughout these states. You generally find the wild type form in disturbed areas. And interestingly, along riverbanks, it tends to be more of a wet soil or almost wetland adapted plant. And in this particular case, it's a member of the Acanthaceae family. So it has seeds that are explosively dehiscent, which means that once a seed capsule ripens, it virtually explodes and distributes the seeds feet apart, feet away from the parent plant, not just beneath the parent plant. Just as an aside, this plant is native to eastern Mexico, but has been itself quite at home in Florida and neighboring states. This is a shot of a photo in a natural area in Florida where the understory is dominated by nothing but Mexican petunia as far as the eye can see. And so you can only imagine the kind of impact that it has on a particular ecosystem here. So in Florida, Dr. Rosanna Frere, shown here on the right in the photo, tackled the issue of this invasive plant that is a great potential as an ornamental. And through much work over many years, she was successfully able to develop sterile forms of Ruellia simplex. She did evaluate all the existing cultivars that were out there currently. And of these, there is one cultivar on the market called Purple Showers, which already is seedless. And unfortunately, it tends to dominate the nursery trade and the gardening trade. There are a lot of other improved cultivars that have thin leaves and pink flowers, like with Murata Chi, or tall and pink flowered like Chi, and tall and white like Snow White, or there is this Katie series of dwarf cultivars. Unfortunately, all of those are very fruitful and quite invasive, and their progeny oftentimes are tall and invasive, so they don't necessarily carry their dwarf characteristics into the progeny. The Mayan series is a series that Dr. Frere was able to develop that are sterile, and she has a series of 4 that are out there now: Mayan white, Mayan purple, Mayan compact purple, and Mayan pink, that are all sterile, medium-sized, compact, and come in an array of colors. And so this is a success story in terms of being able to develop a sterile form of an otherwise invasive species. Another success story comes with Lantana. Lantana camera is a global weed under tropical situations, tropical and certain subtropical situations. And in Florida, it's considered to be a weed throughout almost every county in the state. There are, of course, a lot of cultivars. And in this case, this was a crop that the doctor Sanal Dung tackled. And one particular issue that we had to deal with in Florida is that the non-native Lantana camera is very widely distributed, but Florida also happens to have native species of Lantana. In this case, I'm showing the Lantana depressa. And so not only is Lantana camera an invasive plant, but its genes are also introgressing into the native Lantana, so that the non-native Lantana is contaminating populations, the native Lantana. So it particularly important that we try to reduce the presence of invasive forms of Lantana camera. And as I mentioned, Dr. Zinaldun has been the scientist that has tackled Lantana and has done quite a bit of research. Initially, he evaluated existing cultivars of Lantana camera. He found a number that were female sterile, as in they produced few seed, such as Athens rose, cream, guanine, Paula's pink. He also identified a number of highly male sterile or infertile pollen cultivars like New Gold, Miss Huff, New Red, and Red Butler. And then through quite a bit of extensive research, he was able to combine these traits of female sterility and male sterility into the Bloomify series Lantanas that are currently on the market, currently being sold, that are improvements over existing Lantana camera cultivars and also offer advantages in that since they are sterile, they maintain flowers and produce flowers much larger numbers and for a longer time period than the typical cultivars of Lantana camera. Again, another success story where a scientist was able to develop sterile cultivars of an otherwise invasive ornamental plant, in this case, Lantana camera. There are other scientists throughout the country that are doing similar research in terms of developing sterile ornamentals. And this is just a small sample of some of the ones that are out there currently. And so we're very fortunate that a lot of people are taking up this research effort to develop sterile forms of invasive ornamentals so we don't necessarily lose these from our nurseries and gardens. So just in terms of trying to summarize a little bit, we don't need to despair about invasive ornamentals. Not all is lost. Some cultivars and selections are sterile and can be safely used, safely grown and used in landscapes in certain regions. Some cultivars and selections are decidedly less likely to invade, and through research, we can identify these in terms of which cultivars and which regions in which they're less likely to invade. We need to remember that invasiveness is regional, that in the invasive potential of a given plant is different for different hardiness and climatic zones, depending on cold hardiness in terms of how low temperatures go in the winter, the amount of low temperatures in winter, the timing of low temperatures, soil conditions, pH, drainage, and rainfall are all considerations that affect the invasive potential of a plant. And again, keeping on with this theme that invasiveness is regional, as examples, we have plants that, for example, miscanthus, Japanese silvergrass, is invasive in North Carolina and North Georgia, but research has proven it is not invasive in Florida. Similarly, purple loosestrife is invasive in the North and the Midwest, but not in Florida. Butterfly bush, Buddleia species, are invasive in the Pacific Northwest, not in Florida. And I think you can think of lots of examples of plants that are invasive in Florida, such as Lantana or some other cultivars of things that are tropical or subtropical, and so are much less likely to become invasive where you have freezing temperatures in zones 8, 7, and 6, and so forth. So invasiveness is a regional phenomenon. And finally, I do want to go back to this idea that none of us wants to be responsible for introducing the next kudzu. We all want to support research to scientifically identify invasive plants. We all want to support research to identify and develop alternatives to invasive plants. And then to be responsible, we all, as growers, landscapers, and gardeners, should promote alternatives to invasive plants. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I want to thank you for your kind attention. If you have questions, you can pass those along, and I'll try to answer them in near future at least. And I hope that you become a little bit more aware of some of the issues around invasive plants and specifically invasive ornamentals and efforts to identify and develop non-invasive cultivars of ornamentals. Thank you very much.